This is the third one that we have done here at Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center. We began this last year as a day, or an afternoon rather, of talking about other little known topics in the Civil War, but in a more informal setting than our annual symposium. So invite one or two speakers to talk about a topic, and then leave plenty of time for audience participation and audience questioning at the end. That is the format that that this takes. And so far, we've had one in person, and this is going to be the second virtual. And what I invite you to do is, if you have questions or comments about what you see this afternoon, please write them in the Facebook comment section under this video, or email them to rwilliams@seminaryridge.org. And I have a couple of topics here, or a couple of topics of conversation at the end, but we really want to hear your questions and your take on the topic. So this is going to be a very interesting afternoon. It's a topic that or overall topic that's near and dear to my heart, and we have a really great speaker in Hilda Koontz, who has spent a lot of her life thinking about this topic of the long shadow of the Civil War. So we're very happy to have her. A little bit about Hilda: she has an MA in counseling psychology from the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota, and devoted more than 20 years of her professional career to counseling. She's a former reviewer for the Consulting Psychologist Press and a member of the American Counseling Association. Since 2001, Hilda has been a frequent speaker for the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, our friends down in Frederick, the Little Bighorn Associates, and for numerous historical organizations, including the Civil War Roundtables of Chicago and St. Louis. And I'm happy to say that when Hilda was elevated to vice president of the Gettysburg Civil War Roundtable, I took her seat on the board. So that was how I got my foot in the door of the Gettysburg Civil War Roundtable. So with that being said, I'm going to step aside for a bit here and let Hilda take it away.
Thank you, Pete, for the very nice introduction, and hello to all of you out there. I'm glad that you've tuned in. The behaviors that we associate with mental illness, including what we now call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, have always been part of the fundamental human experience. But it took until nearly the beginning of the 20th century until there was even an inkling of understanding of these conditions, much less any sympathy or treatment for any patient. We now recognize that PTSD is a trauma and a stressor-related disease. It occurs because of one or more traumatic events. Remember, they're always inflicted upon the victim. It could be caused by the actions of others, by an accident, by an act of nature. It can affect anybody, regardless of age, race, gender, or status. And the symptoms include flashbacks of the event, hypervigilance, aggressive, self-destructive behavior, avoiding remembrance of any of those events, distorted thinking, memory, and mood. You can diagnose this once the patient has had symptoms for 30 days. It can have a delayed onset, and it can become a chronic condition. Early humans, of course, did not have this information, but they did observe the behaviors. Actually, the first record of it appears in the Mahabharata Chronicles of India, which was in 5000 BC. It's mentioned in the books of Deuteronomy and Job in the Old Testament. Greek dramas are filled with scenes that give voice to the trauma that their warriors had experienced. And we actually have evidence that the Greeks put on those plays to help those warriors reintegrate themselves into life. Of course, we know Shakespeare wrote about it extensively also. Now, before the 20th century, mental health issue was thought to have only two causes. Either it was an organic structural flaw of the body, or in one way or another, it's your fault. This is classic, blame the victim. Depending on the time period, they thought it might be because you had offended the gods. Perhaps you were worshiping the wrong one. You might have been possessed. It was witchcraft, and the excuses went on. If you were female, you were thought to be having a case of the hysterics, And if you were a male, well, obviously you just lack character and need to man up. Totally made up diagnoses were also used to inform and enforce cultural political norms. Particularly nasty one was something called drapetomania. This diagnosis was given to Black slaves whose only symptom was they had tried to escape slavery. After emancipation, former slaves who exhibited symptoms of a mental illness were written off just because of so-called evolutionary factors. Over the years, PTSD has been given more than 80 names. In 1678, a Swiss physician coined the term nostalgia to describe the depression, the anxiety, the insomnia, and the homesickness of his soldiers. And the only treatment he could come up with to deal with it was send them home. Nostalgia was the term used to describe these symptoms at the beginning of the American Civil War. And it's interesting to note that the only other diagnosis for mental illness at the time was insanity. That was a catch-all term for more extreme forms of mania and dementia. The fact is, medical knowledge simply had not evolved to the point of understanding that there was a science to mental processes that could explain human behavior. We all know the Civil War is the real beginning of modern warfare, and it was fought on a scale never before seen in human history. The latest estimates are that nearly 3 million people served in the armies, North and South together. There were over 1.5 million casualties, 750,000 of whom had died. Between frighteningly effective new weapons, mass frontal attacks, and wholesale slaughter, the soldiers North and South were exposed to unprecedented intimate violence. Most of the soldiers were young and from rural backgrounds. Initially, their only concern was that the war wouldn't last long enough for them to see the elephant. Instead, it lasted 4 long years, and neither the average soldier, the military, or the medical branch was ready for the challenge. The early exuberance of the war quickly dissolved into abject misery. It was an assault on the human body and mind. The troops were severely stressed due to abysmal food, constant marching, rarely having a decent place to rest, seldom a chance for a furlough, rampant disease, and of course, unending violence. Captain H.L. Patton of the 20th Massachusetts describes the state of his troops in June of 1864. Quote, "The men have been so horribly worked and badgered that they are utterly unnerved and demoralized. They are easily scared as a child in the night. You had a campaign of 1 day. We, 53 days long, every day under fire, every night digging and marching. For my own part, I am utterly tired and disheartened, and if I stay at all, it will be like a whipped dog." As you may imagine, the mental toll of the troops was enormous, but neither the medical staff nor military leadership had any understanding of why morale, discipline, unit cohesion, and readiness were breaking down. The strain placed on the troops resulted in nearly 300,000 desertions. Some were so desperate to escape that they shot off their fingers or toes just to get a discharge. During the war, Northern and Southern armies used a medical diagnostic system that had been developed by a British doctor, William Farr. It classified the diseases of the patients, but the system included nothing about mental disorders. So, dealing with mental health issues became the responsibility of the medical staff. And we have to be fair to them. They already had their hands full just trying to deal with the physical injuries of the soldiers, and they themselves were experiencing the same psychological symptoms. We estimate that 10% of the nurses simply collapsed. Many of the physicians collapsed. They posted to less strenuous duty, or they self-medicated with alcohol to deal with their own trauma. Now, alcohol abuse was a well-documented coping mechanisms in the officer corps. 17 federal and 10 Confederate generals were either dismissed from service or seriously injured their careers due to their overuse of alcohol. And likewise, there were many suicides in the officer corps. When you read the first-hand reports and letters of the day, it soon becomes apparent that generals Richard Ewell, George B. McClellan, George Pickett, Gouverneur Warren, and John Bell Hood were all relieved from duty because of their behaviors that we can see are textbook PTSD. In August of 1864, an aide to General Ulysses Grant said this, quote, "Grant is not at all well, and there are fears that he is breaking down." Well, he was. Unremitting stress degrades the immune system to such a degree that the victim is essentially committing emotional suicide. Soldiers who were diagnosed with so-called insanity were sent to the government hospital for the insane in Washington, D.C., whereas a soldier with nostalgia was considered to have a so-called camp disease. In the official records, doctors describe nostalgia patients presenting with the following symptoms, quote, weeping, sighing, hallucinations, watchfulness, sometimes delirious, absence of mind, having a vacant expression, depression, frantic with terror. These are classic descriptors of PTSD. So, depending upon the sympathies of the commanding officer, remedies for nostalgia might include extra drill, make work tasks, once in a while some entertainment. But then there were the other officers who thought all these soldiers needs is another good dose of combat. It'll give the men something to do and thus improve morale. But sadly, some victims were also harassed, shamed, beaten, and even executed for their behavior. And by the way, the British did the very same thing during World War I. Under this endless mental strain, enlisted men also committed suicide. And sometimes they invited the enemy to assist them. And that phenomena is shown in this famous painting by Winslow Homer, which is entitled, Inviting a Shot Before Petersburg. It tells all you need to know about that sad situation. As noted in the medical and surgical history of the Civil War, from 1861 to 65, the Union Army reported 5,213 cases of nostalgia and 2,600 cases of insanity. The Confederate State Medical Surgical Journal says we have hospitals in Virginia who are oppressed with nostalgia cases. Referring to those official numbers, Assistant Surgeon Robert Bartholomew said, quote, "These numbers scarcely express the full extent to which nostalgia influenced the sickness and mortality of the Army." Now, we can never know definitively how many cases of PTSD there were during the Civil War, but we can do a rough estimate if we look at these figures from the VA. During Vietnam, overall, there was a rate of 15% of these cases. By the way, there were some years where it was as high as 30%. The Gulf War, 12%, Iraq, 20%, and Afghanistan, 11%. And I would like to note that in all of these cases, frankly, these numbers are very, very much undercounted. So looking at that, let's very conservatively say that an exposed population in the Civil War could easily have expected 10% of the soldiers to experience PTSD. That would have given us 300,000 cases. Well, we only have 5,200 and some Union soldiers formally diagnosed with nostalgia. We don't have official numbers from the Confederacy. Where could the unreported cases be? Well, no doubt, there were many of them in the ranks of 300,000 deserters. And we do know that 34,000 northern deserters just disappeared from hospitals. And we know there is a rate of 60% comorbidity if you have a physical injury and you're experiencing nostalgia. Some of the patients were sent to local asylums, but quite often the overworked medical staff just discharged them and sent them home because they had no options and no way to care for them. Many soldiers were so disoriented that the Army would put a tag on them indicating their destination, shove them onto a passenger train, and hoped they made it. As you may imagine, it was disastrous. By the middle of 1863, there were so many mentally ill soldiers just wandering around in the North that there was a hue and cry against the practice. The war may have ended in April of 1865, but untreated mental illness in the veteran population caused a tremendous strain on the fabric of American society. Post-war, we see huge increases in the rates of domestic violence, divorce, suicide, and general crime. And to make matters worse, veterans who had a mental health issue were denied pensions, therefore resulting in even more unemployment, poverty, and vagrancy. In 1861, there was a total of 40 insane asylums in all of the United States. Each were designed initially to handle 100 patients. This happens to be the one in Stockton, California, which opened in 1853. Now, pre-war, we had a model of therapy that was called moral treatment. It consisted of fresh air, good food, healthy treatments, kindness. And frankly, it made a lot of very positive impact on patients' lives. However, admissions to these asylums tripled between 1861 and 1870. And by 1880, there were 140 asylums handling over 250 patients each. And by 1900, that patient load had increased to over 1,000 per facility. Chronically ill veterans were also often sent to jail or to the poorhouse, and the treatment at any of these facilities was so obscene, the viciousness of which I do not wish to share with you. It is a stain on the country. In a thorough study of the Indiana Hospital for the Insane during the period, over 51% of the veteran inmates either attempted suicide or did actually kill themselves. Mental health issues, alcoholism, suicide were rampant in Civil War veterans' homes. As one observer said, quote, "It is such a sad sight. The degradation of souls of these old men is worse than the shooting of their bodies in the war." Some of those veterans, by the way, actually banded together, went west, and formed little communes. In that way, when times got tough and they had flashbacks, at least they knew they were surrounded by friends. Now, this is a very wretched chapter, but the Civil War is an important marker on the journey to understanding PTSD. The medical community did not yet understand mental processes, but the surgeons had seen so many cases of nostalgia, and they had experienced it themselves, that at least they were more aware of the situation. In one post-war lecture, Dr. Horace Potter said, quote, "The life of our soldiers of the late war was one continuous hardship on the nervous system. Nevertheless, doctors still felt that mental illness had an organic cause." Now, you may have heard nostalgia referred to also as soldier's heart. And there was one cardiac specialist, Dr. Jacob DaCosta, who called it irritable heart. He did a lot of research on it. He thought it was probably a functional heart disorder, but he never could find a structural explanation for the ailment. The field of neurology also began during the Civil War. Those doctors also were misdiagnosing the effects of trauma as having an organic cause. In the 1880s, they came up with an organic diagnosis for a psychological ailment which was caused by incidents like this. Just a moment. That is kind of a horrifying scene, isn't it? These kinds of rail accidents were common in the mid to late 19th century. Obviously, people would be killed and maimed by them. But there were others who survived, and there were even witnesses to these events who began suffering from all kinds of symptoms that we recognize as PTSD. Well, the physicians could find no organic reason for the symptoms, so they called it railway spine, because they thought, well, perhaps the spinal cord had suffered some sort of concussion, causing the symptoms. Of course, this did not explain why witnesses were also experiencing the same symptoms. And of note, the great writer Charles Dickens suffered from this condition because he had been in an accident. He wrote about it extensively. In the latter part of the 19th century, doctors and philosophers begin to ponder the nature of the mind, and they start to explore explanations for human behavior that goes beyond the organic. In 1889, French physician Pierre Janet said this, quote, "Traumatic stress is an illness of not being able to be fully alive in the present." Dr. Janet was way ahead of his time. This concept went mainstream in 1893 when Dr. Sigmund Freud published his theory that mental disorders were rooted in the unconscious. He called the ailment traumatic hysteria, maintains that it's caused by trauma, it is fueled by forgotten memories, and it's amenable to cathartic treatment. He said, quote, "Hysterics suffer mainly from reminiscences, and this kind of thinking nudges medical thought towards a psychological model of causality." Less than 10 years later, during the Russo-Japanese War, battle-related stress symptoms were finally recognized by physicians and the Russian military. They set up a forward hospital, treated 3,500 soldiers for what they called war neurosis, and the majority of those soldiers were able to return to duty. In World War I, this ailment was referred to as by the term shell shock. In World War II, it was called combat fatigue. But it was only after the enormous number of victims in the Vietnam War and the lobbying efforts of those veterans that this condition was formally recognized as PTSD in the 1980 edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Of special note, the criteria at last specified that this ailment does not just result from combat, it can be caused by any kind of traumatic event, military or civilian. So here we are, 155 years after the end of the Civil War. What do we know about this condition now? Well, first of all, always keep in mind, it is never the fault of the victim. We also know that on average, at least at any one given time, 8% of the total population of the United States, that would be 26 million people, suffer from this condition. And by the way, sadly, after collecting data for 20 years, we can predict that 40% of students involved in mass school shootings will develop some symptoms of PTSD at some point in their lives. So no matter which war or traumatic event you study, it is not a matter of if we will have trauma and cases of PTSD. It's a matter of when and how many. Now, in this next section, we're going to bring you up to date and explore what PTSD is, how it affects patients, and what the current treatments are. But first, we kind of have to put it into context for today. The last time I worked with patients was in March. The world has changed dramatically since then because of the pandemic. It is sad, but it is true that every being on this planet right now is experiencing some kind of psychological trauma every day. And at the same time, we're all experiencing some kind of grief for lost or ill friends or family, but most definitely, we grieve for the ordinary course of our lives. We are seeing so many new increases in depression, anxiety, and suicide. Before, these lectures used to be sort of an academic exercise. Now, this is reality. So that said, let's consider the purpose of the human brain. Obviously, it is an enormously complex topic, but we can boil it down to 3 words. The purpose of the human brain is keep the person alive. Now I want you to imagine the following situation. It's fall, there's still some color out there. You decide to go tomorrow for a nice drive in the country. Picture yourself driving down a 2-lane country road. Everything is lovely until you notice there's a semi-truck coming towards you in your lane. Now what are you going to do? Well, let me think. I read an article in a AAA magazine a while ago about this situation, and they said, now, I can't see you people and I can't hear you, but I suspect when I said that, there are a lot of you who are laughing at me because you all know, lady, by the time you got to the word AAA, it was too late to make a decision as to what to do. And you're absolutely right, because the conscious cognitive brain cannot process a remedy that fast. Lucky for you, the brain is going to send you a helper. I'd like to introduce you to Screaming Person, and all of you have one of these. This is actually a diagram of the stress response. Lots of people like to call this fight or flight. In less time than can be measured, the brain activates the body's stress response and releases an appropriate flood of hormones. These hormones shut down the functions you don't need at this point in time, ramps up the ones you do to save you from the oncoming threat, in this case, the semi-truck. When the crisis is over, the hormones go back to their regular baseline and life goes on as previous until you need this life-saving response again. But here's the problem. With trauma, the levels often don't go down, or when they do, they may go down very slowly and then they soar upwards at the least provocation. This process damages the mind, the brain, and the immune system to such a degree that the person is prone to all manner of disease, infections, heart issues, hypertension, autoimmune issues. Do you remember a while ago, I read you that quote from General Grant's aide when he described how worried they were about him. Well, this is what was happening to General Grant. When someone develops PTSD, the brain is damaged. It continues to do this fight or flight defense. It misfires. It's sort of like a computer loop. The problem is that the victim is stuck there in that moment of original trauma, because the brain processes have forsaken him and he can't integrate new experiences so he or she can live their life here in the present. In the past, victims of trauma had invisible wounds, but now, because of technology, they are just as visible as if it was a broken leg on an X-ray. A true seminal moment, not just in medical history, but in the history of humankind, occurred less than 30 years ago. First, medical researchers had PET scans, and then they acquired functional MRIs, and for the first time ever, we could look inside and really see how the brain works, how it processes information. We could map the circuits of the mind. Those invisible wounds we are now going to look at. Now, this looks like a complicated slide, but we're going to move our way through this one picture at a time. I will say at the outset, these are black and white images. In the original, they were in color, but I'm going to kind of explain that as we go along. Okay. Now, there's an arrow pointing to, and I've got my little cursor on this area in photo number A. When researchers looked at this, these images were actually taken of PTSD patients who were having flashbacks at the time they were in the functional MRI. When the researchers looked at these pictures, the first one in A, they said, yep, this makes sense. In photo number A, the area where the arrow is, right here, shows as red. And on a functional MRI, a red image indicates that there's an enormous amount of activity there. That happens to be the limbic area. It's in our emotional brain. Strong emotions, like that semi-truck coming at you, will activate the amygdala, which is the mechanism that warns of its danger, and this is the area that fires up the fight or flight response. And so the researchers said, that makes perfect sense. That's what should be happening. Now, when we move over to photo B, we're going to look at this little area down here, where their big arrow is. That's called Brodmann's area 19. It's in the visual cortex. In that picture also, that area is bright red in the original. It's an area of intense activity. I'd like all of you to do a little experiment while you're out there, wherever you are sitting. Just take 1 second right now and look at something else in the room. Look left or right or the ceiling, something else. Now come back and look at the screen and tell me, or tell yourself, did I see something different? No doubt you did. So you ask, why on earth is this important to PTSD? Okay, that area that's highlighted is in the visual cortex. And the first time you see a new image, even for just a second, it registers there. So if you are out driving on the highway, that part of your visual cortex notices there's an oncoming truck. The role of that area, which is called Brodmann's area 19, is to decide to do what shall I do with this information? Should I ignore it? Should I memorize it? Or should I take some action? Well, in the case of that semi-truck coming at you, the brain decides, I better take some action. And it did exactly what it should do. It fired up the fight or flight response, which is going to save your life. When the researchers looked at that picture, they were stunned. They didn't expect it. And it literally changed so much of what we thought we knew about PTSD. Up until then, we all thought that the PTSD flashback was a memory of a traumatic event. The fact is, we were wrong. Instead, the brain has been damaged. Now it is rekindling the image in that area. And so for the patient, it feels like it's happening now. It's not a memory, it's happening now for the very first time. Let's harken back to a few years after the Civil War, when we have a lot of veterans who are in veterans' home. Let's look in on one of those lunches they're having. They're all assembled, they're having lunch, and all of a sudden, old Charlie stands up suddenly. His eyes go wide with terror. He screams bloody murder. He says, grab your guns, boys, they're coming for us, dives under the table and shakes with fear. His friends have seen this before. They shake their heads sadly, and one of them said, "Ah, poor Charlie. He's just remembering what happened at Shiloh." No, it's not. in that area right now for Charlie, where that is firing, it's not a memory for him. It's a real event all over again. That is why terror takes over people who have these flashbacks, because it is so real, because their brain is telling them that, because that brain, unfortunately, has been damaged. Okay, we have one more photo to look at. That's photo number C over here, this area over here. That's the Broca's area. And in the original picture, the image looks just like what you're looking at, white. On a functional MRI, a white area indicates there is no activity whatsoever going on. That area is called Broca's. Broca's is one of our speech centers. It's often affected when somebody has a stroke. Without that area being active, it's very difficult to put your thoughts and feelings into words. The reason this is important to know is because a lot of PTSD patients simply do not react very well to talk therapy when they're trying to recover. Talk therapy is a wonderful tool, but it's not the first one to use with PTSD, because literally they cannot get to that area to utilize it. Think of it this way. Let's say you go away from your house for a few days, you come back, there's been a terrible flood, and the only bridge that is serviceable to get to your house has been taken out by the flood. And the DOT says, well, I'm sorry, we have no money to fix it. And you're looking at your house and the flooded out bridge and saying, how am I going to get there? That is the question that PTSD patients and their physicians have to face. How are we going to deal with this damage? Well, first of all, there is no magic pill. Treatment is more like a constellation of options because, as you can see, the trauma affects so many brain processes. The VA can tell you 40% of PTSD patients do not get relief from traditional talk therapies or drugs alone. Now, there are medications. They help specific symptoms like anxiety and insomnia and depression, but they don't fix the underlying cause. Neuroscience, on the other hand, has really not only transformed our understanding of trauma, but it gives us clues to treatments. One of the more simple techniques when we're just trying to diagnose is to use an electroencephalogram, an EEG. It measures the size and the direction of the brain waves. In one direction, the doctor can determine, yes, this is PTSD. In another direction, it could easily be a TBI, which is a traumatic brain injury. We have other treatments like EMDR, eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing. We have neurofeedback. These work on brain circuitry, teaching the brain to create new patterns to get around that bridge that's flooded out. Alternative treatments also are helpful for the same reason. It builds neural pathways. There are programs that use art, music, theater, outdoor activities, sports, dance, even interaction with animals to achieve the same goals. This is one of my favorites. This is an organization called Saratoga Warhorse. They are in upstate New York. The program was developed by a Vietnam veteran to help his fellow soldiers. There is also something called a stellate ganglion block. Now that's a mouthful. This block uses an anesthetic, goes into the ganglion. It's been used for decades for pain relief. If you can see this little notch that we have right here, it's right here, but in the back, interior to the spine. The physician inserts the anesthetic. Interestingly, it interrupts that exaggerated fight or flight response in over 80% of the patients. People who've gone through this say, oh, I can breathe. And if any of you have ever had a panic attack or you've hyperventilated and imagine being like that all the time, you can imagine the relief that this gives the patient. By giving them at least 6 months of this ganglion not firing, it allows us to start talk therapy and other treatments. It's been very, very helpful. And the US Army is funding this with millions of dollars. In years past, if the medical community could not see a visible wound, they could not come up with a diagnosis. They denied the problem, they condemned the victim, and they left the patients uncounted and uncared for. Major John McMurray of the 6th U.S. Colored Troops summed up the sad post-Civil War experience of many veterans in the following, quote, "I relive the horror every year of my life since. I had borne it all with a mighty small amount of sympathy from those around me." It's really heartbreaking to hear his words, and we have the records of that in letter after letter and diary after diary. Over the intervening years, we have gained more understanding, we've developed more treatments, but intensive research continues. Because, to paraphrase the American poet Robert Frost, we have promises to keep and miles to go before we sleep. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here this afternoon. I appreciate you being attentive, and we'll answer Q&A later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hilda. Very sobering, as it should be, discussion. And if people have questions, I invite you to put them in the Facebook comment section, and we're going to get to those later on. So we're going to shift gears here. I am going to share my screen. Rob, I think you as the host can stop Hilda's screen sharing and then allow me to share mine. Thank you. So I am going to talk about opioid use during and in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. And this comes out of a talk that I was asked to give about a year ago now for the Adams County Library System. And I was really concerned when they asked me about trying to find sources. And I was amazed as I did the research for this talk, the amount of sources, the number of sources that are out there, especially from the second half of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century that talk about opioid use. And one of those sources that I found is a book published in 1876 called Opium Eating, an autobiographical sketch by an habituate. And I want to start by briefly talking about this individual's story. I don't believe we know, at least I have not been able to find who this individual is, but we know that he is a United States Army veteran who joins the United States Army in 1861. At age 16, he is a drummer, but he does engage in fighting, and he is captured at Chickamauga in September of 1863 and transported to Richmond, where he ends. He and then eventually down to goes to Andersonville. Upon returning home after Andersonville is liberated, he could not sleep. He's plagued with stomach issues and constant headaches. He visits a doctor and says to the doctor, "Please do not give me opium." He's writing this, he says, "as I had horror of such things." The doctor does give him opium. And then the veteran says, "Knowing then," this is a quote, "knowing then that I was simply an opium eater, I purchased my own morphia at the drug stores, does not need a prescription, and took it by mouth. Thus was I, the notorious fly, invited into the parlor of the deceitful spider." I want to think about today that this is a moment to recognize that the United States has had a long and difficult history with opioids, that what we're seeing now, what we're going through in this country now, is not something that has just appeared in the last decade or two. And I hope that we can see that. So, of course, opium is derived from the poppy plant. The principal narcotic ingredient in it is morphine, which we hear a lot of times being used to manage pain, of course. Benjamin Franklin had been given opium for gallstones. Alexander Hamilton is given it after his duel with Aaron Burr in 1804. Had been used by the ancient Greeks in the Middle East for relief of pain. But people are starting to realize by the turn of the 19th century, and I found you'll see there on the left a pamphlet from 1806, the American Dispensatory, where they're already talking about the destructive properties of opium. And I want to read a quote. Quote, "The habitual use of opium produces the same effects with habitual dram drinking, tremors, paralysis, and stupidity, and like it, can scarcely ever be relinquished." By the eve of the Civil War, you have another book that is published, Therapeutics and Materia Medica, which is also talking about the dangers of opioids. This book says, "The innate and universal propensity of man to employ some artificial means in promoting the agreeable flow of thoughts or emboldening the spirit to perform acts of daring or of steeping in the forgetfulness of the daily sense of sorrow has led inhabitants to seek for the coveted objects in the use of opium." And so that's how we're getting to the eve of the Civil War. With the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, opium and its derivatives are finding a widespread use in both armies. And there is a great resource. It is called the Medical and Surgical History of the War of the Rebellion. I believe Hilda referenced it in her talk, but it is a 6-volume set that gives a really great history of medicine, disease, injuries during the Civil War. And I went in there and I just searched for the term opium. And you can see there on your screen, this is on Internet Archive, a digital site where you can read all of those little blue points on the bottom there of right underneath the text is every time the word opium shows up in just one of the volumes. 10 million opium pills, one of the ways to administer 10 million opium pills are issued to the Union Army. Over 2 million ounces of other preparations. It can be powdered, it can be a liquid, and there are only 2 million men who served in the Union Army through the war. So even just looking at the pills, you had, if my math is correct, 5 opium pills issued for every 1 soldier in the United States Army. The Medical and Surgical History says that this medicine, opium, merits the first place among the remedies for the treatment of chest wounds. It was used almost universally in all cases of severe wounds and was found particularly useful in penetrating wounds of the chest and quieting the nervous system and indirectly in moderating hemorrhage. When used with discretion, there can be no question of its great utility. So they're recognizing at this time that it does have, it is useful in managing pain and useful in managing hemorrhage. Unfortunately, it is being overused, very much overused to treat any sort of injury or hurt. And one of the most amazing quotes that I was able to find was from Nathan Mayer, a surgeon of the 16th Connecticut, who says, "The morphine was a fine powder, the morphine that he's using. The soldiers licked it from my hand as he is on a horse. Mayer is on a horse, and he's putting the morphine into his hand, putting his hand down. The soldiers that he's passing by are licking it, washing it down with some water from a canteen, and then Mayer is giving them a slip to justify the straggling and moving on to the next man. So really almost being given out like candy, certainly being given out without any sort of serious trying to figure out how much is the best to give. To the surgeon on the field of battle, it is his sheet anchor and of as much importance in its use as chloroform. So anything in this case, these doctors are thinking, these surgeons are thinking, anything can be solved through this use of opium, and it's as useful there as chloroform to put patients to sleep before surgeries. Move on here to a man named Private Joseph Brinker. Again, this is from that medical and surgical history. One of the ways that it's most being used is in the treatment of diarrhea and dysentery, because it is a it can dry up excretions. So it stops you from excreting excrement. So that's one of the ways that they are using it. Here you see a soldier who has the fracture of a right femur from a musket bullet in 1863. Patients attacked with diarrhea, and for which opium pills were prescribed. Diarrhea was continuing, more opium. They're not giving him opium for the pain, they're giving him the opium to stop the diarrhea and dysentery. And friends, diarrhea and dysentery are two of the diseases, two of the most common diseases in the Civil War. At one point during the war, if you were a soldier, you could expect to have diarrhea or dysentery be on the sick list for diarrhea and dysentery more than once a year. So if they're using this as a primary way of treating that, you can see there why you have more than 10 million pills being issued in some cases to 2 million soldiers. The medical and surgical history echoes this, says there is the most important medicine in the treatment of dysentery happens to be opium. So this is all to say that the primary focus during the Civil War, we think about Civil War medicine, we used to think about it as very backwards and not advanced. Really, if you look at people like the writings of Shauna Devine and others, in the last few years, we've started to think more about the advancements in Civil War medicine, that doctors were well trained and doing the best with what they knew. But we still have situations where they are not all there yet. And I think that looking at this opium, widespread use of opium is sort of getting at that. You're still treating the symptom, not the disease. So we're treating the pain, we're treating the diarrhea using these pills to shut off those pain receptors, but we're not looking at what the base root cause of the problem is in some cases. If it's visible, if it's a broken leg or a gunshot wound, we can see that what's causing that. But sometimes when it comes to disease and germ theory, which germ theory is about 20 years in the future at the time of the Civil War, we're thinking about treating the symptom using opium. Another big thing that comes at this time, that right on the cusp of the Civil War, that some contemporaries, and I'll read a quote in a second, blame for the widespread use of opium, is the birthed the invention of the hypodermic syringe. And this is out of a medical catalog from the Civil War era. And if you look over there at number 15 on the bottom right, that is the hypodermic syringe of glass. Here's another image of a hypodermic syringe in a case that was from the time of the Civil War. A hypodermic syringe is invented only in 1858, so only 3 years before the Civil War breaks out. And it's recognized early on that now we can inject morphine or some liquefied form of opium directly into where the pain is coming from. And one of the quotes that I have found says, quote, "Opiates administered through the ordinary channels, like the mouth or rectally, usually are some hours in taking effect, but narcotics injected right into the painful spot will diminish the sensitivity of that nerve and in proportion diminish and remove the pain." Looking back from the close of the century, the end of the 19th century, one, quote, authority on addiction blamed the hypodermic syringe for the widespread abuse of opium. "With the coming of the hypodermic syringe," he wrote, "and the widespread popularity of this mode of treatment, coupled with the ignorance and seductive power of this pernicious consequences, it took on a steady growth that for more than 40 years involved a host of victims." So let's take a moment to look at that 40 years following the American Civil War, where this is becoming, where it is taking a host of victims. And remember I said earlier that there are these amazing publications. All of these are available online, and you can actually see at the bottom of each of these images, digitized by Cornell University, digitized by Google from University of Michigan, original from Harvard University. Folks, these are out there. You can find these. I did not go to a library or an archive to do research for this presentation. I sat in my office and was able to find these great resources. So friends, if you want to go and look, they are there. I already talked a little bit about the diarrhea and dysentery becoming chronic diseases, and men are suffering after their term of service. So even when the war ends, these men that had been overcome by these diseases are still suffering from them and are still looking for relief from them. And if it had worked during the Civil War, it's probably going to work after, and it's going to also feel good. So some of these veterans are taking it as a result of that. Still being prescribed in the wake of the Civil War as that sheet anchor or that catch-all, that anything can be solved, any pain can be taken away through the use of opium without getting to those root causes. And women are being prescribed this for anxiety, both men and women, but you see middle-class women also particularly being treated with opium for anxiety, depression, menopause, painful menstruation, and difficult pregnancies. So it's just a way to relieve pain. By 1868, one publication put the number of confirmed opioid eaters at not less than 80 to 100,000. And if you look, as the century goes on, at the end of the century goes on, you see some really just amazing, staggering statistics. Between 1869 and 1909, so 40-year period, it's testified before Congress that there is a 351% increase in opioid consumption. In May of 1903, there are 30,000 users in New York City, but this is just an estimate, and that works out to about 8% of the New York City population being addicted to opium. And this is the most staggering. If you thought those statistics were staggering, this is bad. There's a publication called Some Notes on the Opioid Habit. 3.3 million doses of opium taken in monthly in the state of Vermont for a population of 187,000 people. And I went back and I reread that because that shocked me. So this is a public health crisis. This is a public health crisis in the latter part of the 19th century. I don't think that there's any question of that. People, and as we get to the turn of the 20th century, people are really starting to pick up on this, to realize it. People are recognizing that this is more destructive than any other evil. One person says. The pulpit and the press are thundering their anathemas against alcohol, which is well enough, but little notice do they seem to the blighting effects of this pernicious drug. And part of the cause is just the ease of use. And I'll show you right here. This is an advertisement out of a Gettysburg newspaper. And if you're familiar with local Gettysburg history, that name R. Horner, Robert Horner, will probably be familiar to you. He is a doctor, but has a drugstore. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup for children contains narcotics. And if your child is crying, one way that you can soothe them is with soothing syrup. You'll also see here something called Dover powder, 5 grains. Each tablet contains opium, powdered 1.2 grams. So you don't need a prescription to get this. You can go down to your local drugstore and pick it up. So let's get to the early 20th century, where this public health crisis is starting to reach a crescendo, and people are starting to recognize that something has to be done about it. The United States actually has a position in government called the Opium Commissioner to deal with this. His name is Hamilton Wright, and he writes in an article for the New York Times in 1911. Of all the nations of the world, the United States consumes the most habit-forming drugs per capita. Opium, the most pernicious drug known to humanity, is surrounded in this country with far fewer safeguards than any other nation in Europe fences it with. Here, physicians are often addicted to the habit, and they continually prescribe opium for insufficient causes or without any real excuse. That's 1911. Even as early as 1906, we're starting to see some headway being made in clamping down on this problem. The Pure Food and Drug Act. So in some cases, a lot of this is being distributed in what are called patent medicines, which, you know, there's no FDA at the time. There's nobody really, no government entity checking to see what's in these drugs and what they do. So you start to see the government stepping in and taking more of an active role in what are these drugs saying that they're doing? Are they safe for consumption? And you see a slew of laws here passed between 1906 and about 1914, where they start to do that. It starts with the Pure Food and Drug Act, which is a response to the book The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, and the proliferation of patent medicines. And now we have to label what is on food and medicines and a quantity. So this, what you see up here on the screen, it actually says under the Food and Drug Act, June of 1906. It's a little blurry there, but right above where it says Park and Davis, it actually cites the Food and Drug Act. By 1909, you have an act to prohibit the importation and use of opium for other than medicinal purposes. And by 1914, you have a special tax that's placed on manufacturers and sellers of opium, which diminishes the supply but creates a black market for this. 1934, the Uniform State Narcotic Drug Act prohibits the production of narcotic drugs within state borders except for under specific licenses. And then by 1970, so friends, this is only in the last 50 years, you have the Controlled Substances Act, where it becomes a Justice Department and an Attorney General issue. So I know that if you, and I was in Rite Aid down the street yesterday and saw the notice about right there at the pharmacy about the Controlled Substances Act and what you have to show in order to get a controlled substance. But unfortunately there, friends, we have seen in the last, as if you've turned on the news or live in some areas where this has again become a public health issue, the widespread prescribing of opioids, and then of course a black market sale or black market of opium being established. One scholar, and there's a scholar who I believe just finished his PhD up at Binghamton University on opioid use in the American Civil War, who says that it's the irresponsible prescribing of opioids by doctors in the 1990s and 2000s, very much like the Civil War era, which is leading to this. We also have to think about what America has been engaged in since 2001, the war in Afghanistan, 2003, the war in Iraq, and thinking about what those conflicts have done, and coming home from those conflicts and injuries that have been sustained have done to opium use today. It continues to be prescribed, OxyContin, Vicodin. As of last year, when I didn't update these numbers for this talk, but when I gave this talk last year, the highest prescribing state was the state of Alabama. Here's a quick ad from I think it's 1927 in Boston. There, it's a newspaper article that is talking about about fearing narcotic drugs and how we should be fearful of their effects. So in closing, I want to reiterate again that this is a public health issue now, I would contend, but is something that the United States has a difficult history with, as I hope has been exhibited here. I want to finish finally before we get into our kind of our Q&A section by talking about the conclusion of that soldier that I talked about, that I started my talk with, that soldier at Chickamauga who became addicted to opium. He said, "I did attempt to throw off my shackles, honestly and earnestly, I would have the reader fairly believe. Death would follow sooner from want of opium than it would for want of food. 72 hours abstinence from opium would, I think, prove fatal in my case, and I believe that I would die by the expiration of that time. I now conclude this work, hoping, trusting, and praying that it may be the means of warning others before they taste the venomous stuff of the chasm before them, that to touch it is to tread upon a slumbering volcano, and that once into the crater, they are lost for life." So here we are back. Boy, we really got into some serious kind of heady topics right there. So, Hilda, I have, I'm going to talk about, I want to ask some questions, just sort of topics of conversation. Maybe we can get into a little kind of back and forth here for a few minutes. One of the things that I was interested about in listening to your talk, and I know that it's a little bit, you see it in talking about opium, is the gender roles, and thinking about, you were talking about females, it was called hysterics. Males are told to man up. So is there a gender aspect to what you talked about, that it's sort of seen as not masculine to be to have PTSD at the time?
Somewhat, but when you get into the gender idea, when we talked about the women and you're just having hysterics, there is, I think I would like to emphasize a little bit though, that up until 1980, when it was finally codified in the DSM, it was thought that these trauma-induced things only happened in combat situations. Violence towards women up until then didn't happen because of combat. It was, it was child abuse, it was sexual abuse, it was abuse in marriage, rape, etc. And these things were poo-pooed, it was as if they didn't even happen. So that is part of that gender conversation. I just thought I'd throw that in. With the males, yes, this was the burden that they had to carry, was they weren't being manly enough. And especially when you get back into the Civil War era, even towards the end of the 19th century, men were almost supposed to be like they were robots. Women, they expected to have feelings, but they said she was being hysterical. But men were really being asked to deny their humanity. Because the last time I checked, men and women both have emotions.
Mm-hmm.
You can both cry. Okay, we can both cry. And so it was a tremendous burden on them because they felt unworthy. Society was telling them they were unworthy. The military is telling them that they're unworthy. It was a terrific burden. It truly was. I didn't have it in this talk because we didn't go that deep, but I'd have an advertisement from Life magazine that was in fall of 1945. So, the war is over, they're coming home. And you talk about your opiums, opioids, etc. There was actually an ad in there from a over-the-counter product. Oh, can't remember who it was, Squibs. But anyway, it contained belladonna. Now, belladonna was used commonly to soothe children's croup. And people who've had children out there know what the croup is. But they were also selling it. They had this lovely picture of the family, the wife and the sergeant who's returning and the little girl, and they're selling this stuff over the counter. It will cure your combat fatigue
Mm-hmm.
and your croup. And I'm thinking, wow, what a bargain! I can't wait to go to the drugstore to get this. But they were actually pushing that. But the horror, we talk about the Civil War vets kind of being ignored after the war. Actually, the same thing happened in all of the wars. We see that post-World War I, the British denying pensions for men who had what we call now PTSD. They were denied their pensions. They did, it's 100 years later, they're still doing that. World War II, they had a little inkling of this. They would give them some brief treatment in the VA hospital and send them home. There was nothing. There was no, there was nothing in the community. And it was like, and that generation, that can-do generation that World War II was, they really paid a price for it, because eventually when those men reached retirement age in the 60s, they were 65, 70, there's an explosion of them. Finally, they just can't hold it anymore. They just lose it. And they want VA hospitals. And an interesting study was done at the beginning of World War II by the generals saying, how much capacity do we have in the VA hospitals? Excuse me. And they realized that in the run-up to World War II, 75% of the beds in the VA hospitals were being occupied by veterans from World War I who had mental health issues. So it's that bump, the same bump after the Civil War, the bump and the bump. But the men really paid, the gender roles really took a toll on them. Absolutely.
Yeah. And there's some great a great book that had come out, I think it was in 2015. It was called Empty Sleeves by Brian Craig Miller, and it's all about amputation in the Civil War South, and how men are supposed to be seen as providers, and when they have amputations and the loss of an arm or leg or both or more than one in some cases, they become more dependent on others, and how that is seen as, in the 19th century, dependency is a female trait, and so I'm thinking that they're being dependent on a drug or something may also be a similar. I think that I had seen that in some of the readings that I had found. I want to read a quote. I meant to read this sort of at the beginning of our talk, but I think that it really sort of sums up what we're doing here. And I don't know if you have any reaction to this, but it's actually from the 1960s, believe it or not. A man named Richard Shyrock, who is a professor at Virginia Tech, and he says, "Do we really wish to recall a century later the incredible suffering which occurred on battlefields and hospitals during the Civil War? One would judge from much recent writing on the war itself that there is no such desire. Yet if medical aspects are omitted, the story is not only incomplete, but is unrealistic as a total picture."
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I've been a Civil War buff my whole life, but you think about this whole era, you have to put it into context. What happened in the military, the gleam of bayonets is fascinating, but it's only 10% of the population. What's everybody else doing? What are the women doing? What are the males who are still at home and whatever? But, it's very easy to get caught up into the gleam of bayonets and this movement and that particular piece of armament and et cetera. And it is interesting, but you always have to remember who's out there in the field carrying that weapon, who's executing that forward motion. They happen to be human beings. They are not human doings. They are not robots. And that era in particular, especially getting back to your previous question, had this manly man kind of, persona. Nobody can live up to that. And to live up to that model puts a terrible burden on people. So they got it from all corners. By the way, what you said about when they came home, also there was this crime, this, acting out, et cetera. They didn't have the veterans groups, to their everlasting credit, the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic, recognized the issues that their fellow soldiers were having and did a lot to, they almost acted like social service agencies to try to help these men assimilate back into society, because there wasn't any way to other modalities to do it. And if you look at the press post-war, 5, 6 years, 7 years, people are looking down on these men, even though they're the ones who have sacrificed so much for the Union because of their behaviors, and their behaviors are totally understandable. But by what we know now, perfectly understandable. Absolutely.
Thank you. I'm gonna. I know we have a few questions here. I'm gonna see. Let's see. A lot of people enjoying it. Where did I get the primary sources? Sean, I'll have to look back into my notes. I put a few of them up on the slide itself, but I did, or on the slide deck itself. but I will I'll go through and maybe a little bit later on this thread post some of those sources. And yes, all of those are available online. Coca-Cola's Invention and Syringe. I know that Coca-Cola at one point, I believe, contained cocaine, and I'm not exactly sure where and if what that had to do with the surge of Coca-Cola. But that's a great question. We might try to find that out. Can you speak to which universities led the way on these studies after the Civil War? I'm not sure that, and I believe the question is about opium. I'm not. I'd have to look back again, but it is. You see it in newspapers, things like the New York Times, and universities at the end of in the latter part of the 19th century are really just kind of coming into that sort of research university model. So it would be interesting to see, and I'll check my notes to see if I have that, and check the sources to see which ones of those are, if any, are doing these research studies. But I see it I've seen it in newspapers and in pamphlets that are just kind of published by some of these smaller publishing houses. I don't recall seeing anything that was in actual from universities. Yes, Jonathan Jones, somebody wrote, is the Binghamton researcher. He just finished his PhD in I think it was this past year, and he is the one that is his dissertation and probably his book was called "A Mind Prostrate: Opiate Addiction in the Civil War's Aftermath." So looking forward to reading that. Somebody commented that he's going to be teaching at BMI soon, so it's going to not be that far. Rob, do we have any other questions that have come through on email?
No, you've got them covered.
Okay.
One thing I have.
Yes.
You're going to put that list of references on the thread, for PTSD.
Yes.
Yeah. Normally, I'm handing pieces of paper out, but I have a list of internet resources that you can go to. One is the NIH. There's VA. There's the Mayo Clinic. And unfortunately, I have to include the suicide hotline because this is relevant. But these are vetted sources on the internet, which I recommend that you go to if you want to read more about PTSD now. You have to watch what you read. These people you can trust, okay? They're good sources. And I have to say this also for the VA. For a long time, they did not treat PTSD patients nearly as well as they should have. They have made a lot of improvements in the last few years. They have centers of excellence around the country, but any veteran can go to any VA facility and ask for help for PTSD. They might not be the center of excellence, but they will do something that you could call triage until you can get them further into the system. We're not perfect, but we're working on it. Okay?
Thanks, Hilda. And so I think that that's a good place to wrap up. So I want to thank all of those folks who joined us here today on Facebook. Of course, we would love to be in person doing this program and gathering together to be able to talk about this important issue. But we're trying to do. We all have to stay safe. Hopefully, we're doing the next best thing, and maybe folks that might not have been able to come here on site, even if times were good, can view this, and it's gonna live on Facebook. I want to thank Hilda for joining us today. It's been it's a sobering topic, but one that needs to be talked about, needs to be acknowledged, and needs to be addressed. And I also want to thank Rob Williams, our Director of Outreach here at Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center. Rob is always the man behind the curtain on everything that we do, and he does not get enough accolades for the work that he does in putting together programs like this. and running the digital end of things. He's the man behind the curtain, the man behind the camera, and we wouldn't be here, and you wouldn't see all of this great digital content that we're turning out without Rob's help. So thank you, Rob. And we hope that you'll join us again on Tuesdays. We have our weekly Facebook web series, On the Ridge or Beyond the Ridge, depending on where we are. So that's at 2 o'clock on Tuesdays, and we are thinking about a lot of great events for 2021, either virtually or in person or a combination of the two, depending on the situation. So we hope that you'll join us for those, as we'll be putting them up on our website and putting them up on Facebook as they come out. And if you liked what you saw here today, please like it, please share it with a friend, comment, let us know that you enjoyed it. Let us know what you'd like to see in the future. We're going to do another research roundtable in April. We don't have a topic picked yet, but we will soon. And again, my name is Pete Miele. I'm Executive Director here at Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center. Thank you again so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you on the Ridge soon.